My name is Rachael Cerrotti, and the name of my book is We Share the Same Sky. We Share the Same Sky is the story of my decade-long journey to retrace my grandmother's war story. She was a Holocaust survivor from Czechoslovakia and the only survivor in her family. And throughout my 20s, I followed her path of statelessness. So that was almost 20 years of her life. She was displaced during the war and then went on to be saved by strangers during the war and then eventually made her way to America. So for 10 years, I essentially collected her story, retraced her story, interviewed people who were connected to her story, and also moved in with the descendants of people who saved her life. And the book chronicles her journey and then also my journey through my 20s. I knew I was going into a career of storytelling. I really wanted to be a photojournalist. When I was younger, that's the path that I was following. And like every young storyteller was told during that time, it was like, pick a story and start a blog. In the last year and a half of her life, we spoke and talked and just got to spend time together. And then after she passed away, I essentially became the unofficial family historian and took her diaries and her photographs and all these primary source documents. And it was this like incredible treasure trove of an archive. And that spiraled into a project that became a different project that became a different project. So it went from photojournalism to wanting to write a book, and then it became a narrative podcast. And then the book came out after that. So I started it as a photography project. So I say that was my means of collecting, like that was my way into people's homes. So, to tell someone you're a photographer and you want to spend some weeks living with them, it sort of makes sense. It's a little bit different than, saying I want to come in and just observe. So that was a really good tool for me to enter the worlds and lives of people I didn't know, particularly when there was a language barrier. The camera served as a really incredible tool of communication. And I also simultaneously knew I wanted to write a book. That was always a plan. I at first thought it was going to be more of like a travel book. And then, as the work matured and changed over the years, it eventually became a memoir. It ended up coming out as a narrative podcast first. And that was a total surprise to me. Like I kind of tripped and fell into audio production. I had written a manuscript and then I started writing the podcast. And so I was pulling from the manuscript to write the podcast, but I had to completely learn a whole new way of writing because audio writing is nothing like literary writing. And then when I finished that and went back to finishing the book, it was like this whole like switch again of having to go back to like literary where it's like, okay, you can use like commas and, longer sentences and more flowery language, which audio storytelling doesn't really allow for as much. So going back and forth was like a very, it was a little bit of a challenging time in my head to like move from one to the other simultaneously. I think anyone who does long-term documentary work has this like internal struggle with themselves of like, I need to be done, but also like, can I ever be done? But there came a time in around 2019, I don't know, it just fell into place as like a nice ending. Some people had passed away. There were some just chapter markers happening for me personally in my own life. And it felt like, okay, time to be done. I had come back and I started to public speak about the project, which I do a lot of, and I teach it in classrooms and run some workshops. And I noticed that like a lot of the questions that people were asking me were more about my feelings and my experience going back into family history, going back to these places, the relationship building I was doing with descendants of people who saved my grandmother's life. Those were the conversations that actually got like really deep and meaningful for me and also opened up my mind a lot. Like there was the history component that you kind of, that you learn, but the way that this was opening up conversations about finding connections with people who are strangers or working through our own questions about, what do our family stories mean to us? What have we heard from past generations? A lot of people be like, oh, you're so lucky that you have all of this material from your grandmother. And that would start a conversation about, why some people choose to tell their story after traumatic events versus why people don't. And these conversations became like the depth of the project in many ways. And the only way to really bring those conversations and those experiences and those connections to the forefront was to do it through me as the connector between past and present. Then I'll say the other part of it, it was like really cathartic. I went through some traumatic events in my own life, which during this time, which the book goes into, and writing became a really important tool of healing for me. And that also made me realize how writing became a really important tool of healing for my grandmother. So there were all these other connections that were being made, that just, our stories needed each other to make sense. The fact that this is like in people's hands of strangers that I don't know around the world is like definitely a feeling I'm still settling into. But it's brought me so many wonderful conversations and connections to people. And it's like the gift that, keeps on giving. And the paperback will come out this summer, which means it'll, hopefully get to more students and classrooms. All of these ideas that I've collected from We Share the Same Sky over the years and the conversations that I've had, you know, this work, is quite, it's very personal to me in terms of the fact that it's like my life and my family's story. But not only has like this project let me go deeper into that space, but it's opened me up to so many other people's family histories. And I've had such a privilege of getting to hear other people's stories as a response to me telling my story. And so now that, kind of the book is done and I'm able to like have some of that space back to think about other creative pursuits, I started a new podcast called The Memory Generation, which hosts conversations with people from all different backgrounds and walks of life about memories that they've inherited and stories that have been passed in their families from one generation to the next. And it's been this really wonderful opportunity to take all these lessons that my grandmother passed down to me by leaving her story for me to explore and be able to use that as a tool of learning about other people's worlds. Embrace fragments of sentences. Like a lot of my favorite writing that I've done, or like the writing that has felt best to me, has been like started as like 3-word phrases in my phone, like walking down the street and like just like something will spark in my head, or I'll be in a conversation with people. I always tell people, I'm sorry, I'm not being rude, I'm not texting. I just like have a thought in my head. And if I don't write it down, it'll disappear from me. I used to want to sit down and like draft things and write things with like punctuation and full sentences. And I've gotten like really into like fragments of thoughts and just writing them on pieces of paper and writing them in my phone and then like letting them sit for a little bit and percolate and then seeing what they become.